Hi, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today on this DevOps.com webinar with Techstrong Learning. We're going to be talking about SRE, and we have truly an amazing panel. I'm super excited to get this conversation rolling. So let me take care of a little bit of housekeeping before we start talking about SRE. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we will send out an email with a link to the recording. The good news is no slides, so you don't have to sit through slides. This is going to be engaging conversation. So you'll get that email with the recording. You're welcome to review it again, so you don't have to take detailed notes. You can share it with a friend, etc. We're also giving away 4 gift cards at the end, and we'll announce who those winners are close to the end of the webinar. And most importantly is this is a conversation not amongst 4 or 5 of us, including myself, but also with you. So we've got a really great platform that we do these webinars on. It's got a really nice chat feature, Q&A, really simple to use. Feel free to jump in there. Start by saying where you're joining us from. But as we're talking, feel free to ask questions, make comments, and we'll try to roll that in, and sometimes even you direct where the flow of that conversation goes. So the more engaged you are, more than likely, the more all of us will get out of it. So thank you for doing that in advance. So let's move on to our topic, SRE. My name is Mitch Ashley. I am CTO with Techstrong Group. I'm also principal at Techstrong Research, which is an analyst firm. It's part of Techstrong Group, covering DevOps and cloud native and security, infrastructure, and AI and data. So I'm excited to be the host of this. So let's jump right to our topic, and I'd love to have our team here, our panel, introduce themselves. I'll take away that intro slide. Kevin, why don't you start? Tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about Everbridge, because you're a solution architect with Everbridge.
Hi, my name is Kevin Keaney. I'm a solutions architect with Everbridge. I specialize in a product called xMatters. I have been doing this for 20 years. So I started as a release engineer, and then as release engineering became DevOps, I ended up becoming a DevOps engineer, and then after that, an SRE engineer. So that's been my entire career. With the product I'm working on now with xMatters, if you've never heard of it before, it's a find and assign, similar to PagerDuty, but the next phase of it is for us, and where I find it strong is with Flow Designer, and where you'd find it useful, because Flow Designer is a no-code ability to launch things like Ansible, Puppet, Chef, Teams, you name it, and allows for all the automation that we all are trying to accomplish on the event coming in.
Excellent. Thank you, Kevin. Pradeep Padala, CEO with Filament. Would you introduce yourself? Tell us about Filament.
Hey guys, this is Pradeep Padala, co-founder CEO of Filament. Thanks, Mitch, for inviting me, and great to be on this panel. Looking forward to having great discussion. Very quickly about me, before Filament, I started a company called ContainerX, where we built a container management platform, a platform on top of Docker, managing containers. And at Filament, we're working on a SRE automation platform, primarily working on helping people in incident response and incident management, and making it super easy to build those workflows. So we have a no-code interface for that, have integrations across many tools as well. In terms of where we are, we're based in San Francisco Bay Area. We're about 20 people, just ramping up a lot of our work here in this market. Looking forward to the panel.
Excellent. Justin McCarthy, who's CTO and co-founder with StrongDM. If you'd introduce yourself.
Sure thing. Hey, Justin. As you mentioned, CTO and co-founder at StrongDM. So StrongDM is all about actually a lot of the folks that are on this call. So folks that are primarily members of technical staff, getting connected as humans to the infrastructure that we all manage. So one way to think about it is everyone that's ever processed a request for access to that cluster, or can I please get access to that database? If anybody's ever received a request like that before, we're the product that formalizes that and connects your users through in an auditable way. So that's what we're all about. And that means that we deal with a ton of DevOps, SRE, engineering, data science teams. And then of course we have all of those internally as well. So this is my day-to-day, everyday, and I love it. Thanks.
Excellent. And last but certainly not least is Anthony Evans, solution architect, former SRE with StackState. I'm not sure if that's right, but Anthony, tell us about yourself.
So my name's Anthony Evans. I work for a company called StackState as a solutions architect. We basically do observability and AI ops, but with a high focus on next generation technologies like Kubernetes and cloud and whatnot. We do observability for other things outside of that, but keeping up with the rate of change is what we specialize in, and aligning environmental changes or configuration changes to outages is part of what we do. The reason why I put former SRE is that, I was an SRE. I was an early employee at ServiceNow back in 2009, 2010, when software as a service was still new. And I had to work 6 days a week in a basement in London, looking at Tomcat logs, MySQL databases, tuning things, looking at performance issues. So I've lived through the pain of being that person who's on the hook for reliability and for maintaining the customer experience. I also host a podcast called The Stack Pod, available on Apple, Google, and Spotify if you're interested in learning more.
Yeah, definitely check that out. Well, fantastic. We do have, I think we've got the right people here to talk about SRE. So let me start off the conversation this way. For many of us, and I'm not the expert because I'm holding the book, but many of us, kind of start out the conversation. Either we're living it or we hear about SRE, so we go, get the book that's been written by the folks from Google as a starting place for what is SRE, and let me learn more about it. I'm curious, in your all experience, is that still a good baseline foundation to say what SRE is, or have we evolved past that and it's much, much more? It's expanded or migrated or whatever. Pradeep, why don't you start us out?
Sure, Mitch. I think Google guys have done a great job writing that book and explaining what is SRE and how to do SRE. I think from core principles, it remains the same today in terms of like having those DevOps process, automation, production readiness, all of that remains the same. But I think it has evolved in a way that the people have accepted that SREs are software engineers writing code for infrastructure. I think that's become much more common now than before that. I used to be a sysadmin when we called people system administrators, right? Like managing servers. Now, I would say we are all SREs, software engineers building products or managing infrastructure. I think that's a big difference, and that's a great thing. I think that's a great advancement since the book is written.
It's been a while since I've looked at an Apache Tomcat.
Yeah. But the core principle. Yeah, exactly. But core principles remain the same, I think.
Great. Who wants to jump in next? Justin.
I'll jump in if that's okay. One of the key things, so it's one thing to be an SRE at Google, right, where technology is your business, right? I think one of the main challenges SREs face is that when they're being leveraged as like an incident response for maybe financial services companies or people whose primary business has tech associated to it, but a bank is there to make money, and like technology helps them make money, right? And so an SRE there, I find, struggles to have more impetus in the development cycle than you would do at, say, Google, right? Because everybody's on the same ship there, and everything's focused on technology. So I'd say that although the role of an SRE has been really well defined and really well validated in, let's say, more of the technology companies, I still think it's a struggle for people to be seen as something more than just the incident responder, right? I think there needs to be more emphasis on the importance of what a site reliability engineer is, and less around the guy who reacts, or the girl who reacts, I should say, to an issue, to being the person who helps optimize the applications and the development, because it's not an outage engineer, right? It's a reliability engineer, which I think is something that a lot of organizations still struggle with.
And I think part of that comes from, it's like I ran an SRE team, and before that I ran a DevOps team. And I always told my guys that if you had to log in as root to the production servers, you've already not done your job. Now, it doesn't mean that you don't have to do that occasionally to fix a problem. But as Anthony was saying, with, making things more stable, getting all your automation set, that the flow into production should be happening automatically, and your stabilization should be happening in your QA environments and in your staging environments. And when you're always logging in as root, that's when the people who are in charge of the servers, the sysadmins, their bosses are like, that's when you start losing their confidence.
Jump in there, Justin.
Sure. Well, I think I have, in terms of what SRE has evolved since the book, I'm going to just go back and respond to that. I know that in my mind, I keep seeing actually the SRE book and a couple of other principal tomes sort of ripped apart, maybe at the binding, and then the chapters interleaved a bit, because that's my experience of the role of SRE is actually that it doesn't exist in a very strict lane. And I know every time I hear the word shift left, in my mind, I replace it with smear right and left. Because basically for every atom of awareness that you can have about, like how a machine likes to behave, you can share a little bit of that to the left, right? And then for every way that you might think about how to respond to a particular condition at a line of code level, you can share a little bit of that knowledge to the right. And so especially when you're sort of sub Google scale, which definitionally everyone is, I think of just a community of folks that are going to be dedicated to solving the problem of awareness and the ability to respond. And then within that community, people are going to gravitate toward the particular subset they feel really excited about, right? And so that might feel like software engineering. That might feel like a whole heck of a lot of Terraform. In our environment, there's a significant fraction of that actually feels like data science to me. Okay. And so what I would say is actually the blending into how we look at data generally actually just becomes sort of this unified analysis plane where and that's actually been a huge part for us, is treating a lot of the telemetry that we collect within an SRE context and just making it perfectly blendable with the rest of the data that we monitor about the business.
I think that's a really fascinating point too, because you can argue we're past the red, green, amber days, right? And operations isn't just about up, down, and who do I call, to be overly, maybe insultingly simplistic, but much more of an engineering kind of focus, data driven. Let's really understand the behavior of our apps, our infrastructure, our stack, all of it, right? Because it's all software, virtually all of it is now. So it is. Would you agree with me in saying it is much more of an engineering discipline to understanding what's the behavior and the planning capacity for our apps, and let's just say our software stack, because it's probably not justified to say it just apps. Feel free to agree, disagree.
I mean, I agree and disagree, and this is why. For the companies that have embraced DevOps theory and embraced SRE, what you just said is absolutely, I agree. I would say 60 to 70% of the people I talk to on a daily basis, they're back in the 1990s. Their automation is almost nil. Their automation to response is nil. And it's where a lot of these books and stuff come in useful to them, because they're starting the journey that a lot of the people on this panel started in 2007 to 2008.
That's a really good point. It's easy to forget, we might be here on the curve and others are earlier in that adoption. Other thoughts?
Yeah, I think people are calling this cloud engineering these days, Mitch. It's not as well defined yet, but that's one way to look at it, that there is a team that's not just about incident response, but also about reliability as a whole, or overall treating infrastructure like how we treat products, and build an engineering team to manage that, the right tools, products for that. But that's something I think many of us, we have kind of arrived at. Some other companies are already there, but many companies are still struggling. The big challenge is cost and ROI, right? So when we go and talk to our customers, or many of the folks here, we see the same, that 60-70% of the people, they're like, okay, it makes sense that I want to get good high availability, but should I hire a software engineer who might cost me a lot to do that? So that's a real problem, right? So even though I think philosophically, conceptually, yes, having a software engineer writing code for the cloud as a cloud engineer makes sense. Is that good ROI for whomever is in charge, whether it is IT or the GM of the product business unit? I think that's a question still to be resolved. That's why this divide still is there, even though we want to think of it as an engineering discipline.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to go too much off topic here, but that was a good point, Pradeep. And I mean, to kind of add to that, right, is so when you've got Kubernetes now, and you've got an entire app that's continually changing, right, and it's written not just in one coding language, right? You're going to have your Node.js developer who likes NoSQL databases, and then you're going to have your Java developer who loves relational databases. All of a sudden, all of this stuff is now together in one application, and it's on the site reliability engineer to be the person that makes sure that this thing runs, and that, you know, each one of those services is communicating to everything else. If you look at the job descriptions that people put out these days for SREs, first of all, the thing that makes me laugh the most is that they always ask for 10 years of Kubernetes experience. Kubernetes is not 10 years old, just so that everybody is aware.
It may feel like 10 or some years, but yes.
They're literally asking, though, for full stack developers. And I think that's a very expensive way of solving that problem, right? And ultimately, the other challenge you have is that a full stack developer doesn't want to just do site reliability, right? They want to build stuff. They want to be part of the development process. They've got their computer science degree, and they've got all that. They don't want to be sat there telling developers off or working with developers on error logging, because that's not entertaining in the long term, right?
I'm curious about that. To that point, do you have to be a developer of some type, or at least able to do scripting in whatever language, Python, pick your favorite language? Is that a critical skill for SRE engineers, or it's a bonus if you have it?
You need to be able to script. I mean, anyone can tell me if they disagree, but I've seen guys in SRE, or girls as well, that might not have that, but they're the people who were left behind. I'm not saying you need to be a full stack developer, but you need to be able to think critically and be able to script based on that.
Yeah, I think you need to really, in order to be able to. So I've worked with SREs that just would see an error in the log or whatever, then throw it over to me, because, you know, I understand the context of the error, you know, and they're actually not the most helpful type of people. What you really need from the SRE role is somebody who can look at a log or an error or something, and at the very least be able to align it to a potential outcome in the product, right? So maybe I can't check out on the e-commerce site anymore because the database is down or whatever. A lot of SREs lack that capability to align context, you know. So if they're seeing something, what is the end user's impact, as opposed to me just figuring out who I need to get to fix the issue, because that will help define a lot of stuff.
Anthony, to follow on that point, that reminds me of something that I'm seeing pretty clearly in our operations every day. and then of course among our customers as well. For every one of these sort of pools of expertise, you need more than one person that truly understands whatever that component of the system is. And then you also need ambassadors in and out of that subject matter expertise. Okay. One of the ways that we do that is we develop empathy by just having a lot of rotation so that there's not a hard wall, and so that, everyone is kind of seeing what's possible on the other side. If I'm primarily concerned with how do I get this into a time series that I can look at, then I might actually spend a minute side by side or a couple days side by side with one of the developers that's feeding into that time series. Okay. And then I'll be able to understand that based on the DSL or the factoring and layering of the application, I can see that there's actually a huge lever for logging that information in a consistent way. And then that gives me the language to, when I ask for a little bit more instrumentation, I'm phrasing the request in a way that's like really efficient, because the person that's going to put it in knows exactly how to put it in and exactly what layer. Okay. And that becomes possible when you just do ride-alongs and you just trade seats. It might slow somebody down for a day. The education is worth it. Okay. And so that idea, you could apply that, of course, to Kubernetes as well. On any given software engineering application development team, you're going to have some folks that are naturally attracted to understanding Kubernetes, and it's not going to be the full population. Okay, so rely on those folks who are attracted to understanding how Kubernetes works, right? And then they become the bridge and the ambassador to maybe some of the other folks that are actually configuring the cluster.
Go ahead, Pradeep.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, Mitch, it's true that we want engineering skills or writing code, scripting for SREs, but in a large SRE team, like I had when Containx was acquired by Cisco, so in Cisco we had a large SRE team where there is a platform team that was reporting to me and a few other folks as well. So the platform team is responsible for Kubernetes and managing that. So that is a slightly different set of skills. How do you deploy, manage Kubernetes? And then there is another team that is writing more deployment tools or writing code in Terraform. So that's a slightly different skill set, I would say. And then there is also compliance. We did a huge compliance effort when we joined, because as a big company, you have all these efforts around working with the larger IT. There could be a central security team or compliance team. So you work with them to get compliance done for your product, which this SRE team is responsible for. That's more about, these days there are many tools like Sneak and many others that give you a lot of this information. But that's more about going through those issues, working with product teams. So there is a lot more of that. Not necessarily coding, but I think you need those skills as well. Working with different teams. So I would say I think a well-rounded SRE team will have different sets of people. There will be strong coders who can write code quickly, efficiently, with high quality. But also there are people who can manage something like Kubernetes in a much better way than maybe other folks. So I see it as a mix of that.
I think one of the things that's changing, depending where you are on that journey, is we're in an environment where things constantly change. We don't have a static app that's sitting out there for days or weeks or months, without change. It's a dynamic environment, whether it's how many Kubernetes clusters are running or Lambda, serverless apps, whatever it might be. And so manually doing things becomes a challenge very quickly. I'm curious about, so when DevOps started, so the mantra was software is everything, software is king, queen, whatever. And we don't need operations people. We don't need these folks over here doing these jobs. And of course, I remember those conversations as my job going away. And of course, none of those jobs went away. They became more important. Other things got added to them. So we value all those jobs, by the way. There was a couple comments by Jayesh and also Peter in the chat. And folks, please jump in. We'd love to have your questions, your comments. Is SRE a way of sort of protecting our jobs? Is it an evolution of an operations job, or is there still ops and SRE focused skills, people doing those two roles? Are they the same or different?
I can start, guys. I think this is a very interesting topic. I mean, we were talking about this before we started as well. It's unfortunate that like there is all these different terms like DevOps, Ops, and SRE and cloud engineering now, right? To me, it's more of like there is a product development team, someone who's writing code for the product, and then there is a infrastructure, whether we call it engineering, ops, infrastructure team that's managing the infrastructure for that product. It's very hard to combine these two. I have had engineering teams where we tried to have the same people do the work from both sides. It's not because people don't like on call. It's more about someone likes writing, let's say, recommendation algorithms. They don't want to write code in Terraform, deploying a virtual machine, right? So it's not necessarily the same thing, even though both are writing code or both roles require writing code. But regarding the topic of DevOps, I think DevOps is a philosophy of having these two teams work together. They will always be separate in principle, right? So they're doing different things. But it could be a single team that has one boss kind of thing. It doesn't mean that same person has to do both. That's how I see it, where there are multiple people, but they work together, and there is back and forth. If there is an SRE who found a problem in production, goes back to product code and fixes a problem, that's totally fine. We should allow that. Same thing with the developer who found something in production, he should be allowed to fix it as well. That goes both ways. So that's how I see it. It's more a product team versus infrastructure team, and they should work together. SRE versus DevOps, I think it's a more of like how it evolved over time and the terms evolved. I see DevOps as a philosophy that's part of SRE. But I'll pause there. I want to hear everyone else's thoughts.
I think one unifying force is just to have SLOs that are easy to understand and easy to see, and then you sort of can focus everyone on some of those numbers, and they're easy to celebrate as well. So once those are easy to see, easy to celebrate, when you when you get into an incident, sort of a post write up, you might point to a change that you make in process or technology or whatever. And the implementation might span multiple different teams or roles, but just folks are focused hopefully on the outcome, and then that just puts less pressure on the boundaries, and maybe reduces the possibility of sort of I'm responding to what Peter's hinting at here, some of the divisions between teams that might be established, right? So if you can promote the numbers to a high scope that the whole team is responsible for, then hopefully that gives you some of the language for rallying around creating a great experience for your customers.
Shared objectives and alignment to help people in their different roles.
Yeah,
sounds like a reasonable thing to strive for. One of the things I'd like to get to is try and help people with resources. In the developer world, there's all kinds of things, whether it's patterns for creating software, of course, open source, and a lot of different things. Are there tools, techniques, frameworks, resources that people can leverage? I mean, we talked about the SRE book. There's Alex Hidalgo's got a great book on SLOs. Are there some resources people can draw on, or is it you just kind of define it for your role, your job, your situation when it comes to SRE?
I would say a lot of it is based on the company and where the management sits. And my last place what worked real well is the entire SRE DevOps team. It was 3 of us, and there were still plenty of developers. And what happened was each of the teams rotated people onto the DevOps team, or the SRE. We called it the infrastructure team because it was completely cloud-based. We didn't have servers. And so that at any time, there'd be 8 or 9 people on the SRE/DevOps/infrastructure team, but 5 of them were full stack developers that would be rotated off in a month or 2 months. And it gave us a lot of that intercommunication that Pradeep was talking about, because a lot of times you'd look at them to reach back to their teams, and it gave them a good idea of what was going on at our level as far as keeping the servers up to date and keeping the deploys going. But that was simply because we did have the advantage of we were completely cloud based, and we all reported into the same VP, so he could just say make it happen.
Yeah, and I think the SLO, and Justin touched on this a few minutes ago, but I think if upper management really has like a customer first type approach to everything, like with a service level objective, not just being, is the system up or down, but, is it responding correctly? How many checks and balances do we have in place to ensure that, Anthony Evans, who's user 1,000,002 on the website, for argument's sake, is he having the same type of experience in terms of smoothness, fluidity, and all this kind of stuff as somebody else? And when you're an individual contributor, you can take on that mindset yourself. But then if you're not supported by the resources around you in terms of, taking on the mentality of, oh, if this happened once, it can happen again, or let's just not automate something for the sake of automation. What's going to be the impact here? What can we say in terms of tangible impact that we're going to have for our end users? And the only way that can really happen is when senior management really look at an SLO as more than just a number, but as a striving for excellence in a way that kind of slips away a lot of the time. And then all of a sudden you'll find that the SRE role is critical because you're on the front line now to make sure that, the SLO is being met and you've got all the different landmines in place to be able to catch it if there are any issues, right?
Mitch, I wanted to respond to the resource question, the resources and training. So this is one that I believe deeply, and I think we reflected in some of our practices at StrongDM. There's just no substitute for practice and doing it. Okay, but the project that we have to work on right now isn't necessarily the project that's going to reveal the lesson or the upgrade. Okay. So you have to find time, whether you call it drills, whether you call it practice, whether you call it 20% time, whether it's self-assigned or group assigned, you have to create synthetic stuff that allows you to see into the future and allows you to see how stuff could be better that you then throw away. It's just an exercise, okay? Because we're also a security product, in security, you have these things called pen tests, and you have these things called capture the flags, which are exercises that are designed to help pull people through some real situations, right? How MongoDB performs when it's at redline is a real situation that people often don't face until it's a critical moment. Okay, so redline some of these underlying systems and practice getting out of that pickle, right? Like that's something where I've just been advocating for bringing some of that CTF culture into SRE and DevOps, and that's just an example where like you don't get a lot of occasions to synthetically create these systems under duress, gamify it, have fun with it, and then show how these tiny minutia of how transactions are handled in this particular state store have this huge cascade of impact on read performance, even on this replica over here, et cetera, that whole story. Experience it, not in production, and make sure you're allocating time to do it. The depth of learning that we get from experiencing things is just so much deeper than any article we're going to read. So like do it and feel it. So that's the resource. The resource is allocating time.
Yeah, definitely. I think we did this in our teams as well, that we would have weekly war room kind of scenarios, but simulated, especially when you're introducing new technology, like we were introducing Kubernetes, containers in production, right? People understand how it works, but when things go wrong, what do you do? What is the run book? What are the steps to follow? So we simulated disaster recovery scenarios as well, that you have to switch from one zone to another, what we used to call as pods, like fault domains. That's a huge process. Even though most of it is automated, you still have to check a few things and do it at the right time, inform the right people. There is some process involved as well. And it's also very helpful for new people. If someone joined just recently, they can see that how this would work. and you would put them on call and have them run through the runbook, and they're like, oh, I don't know what this means. SSH to production server, where is it, right? So maybe you don't want to log in, like Kevin said, right? So you don't want to actually go and run commands there, right? So maybe that's outdated. We probably have a tool that does it, and we authenticate the right way. So those are the things I think that's a good process. We used to call it production readiness. I guess that's the larger principle of like, how do you make your team ready for running in production? That's probably one of the frameworks that's good to have.
Pradeep, I'll just offer another one from security is the idea of a red team and a blue team.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you have some folks on the team that are basically designing the puzzle, right? Like, I'm going to break the system in a particular way that's maybe going to be subtle, right? And then have another part of the team try and crack the puzzle. That's just a really exciting one. I actually think back to years ago when I had some servers that were actually in Iraq and actually had a cable failure that negotiated down to 10 megabit instead of gigabit. Like, it was very hard to see because it was just one server in the cluster and it was just one cable, right? And so you can still create those kind of subtle degradations in modern cloud infrastructure where you can cause, one node of your case cluster to, just with respect to file system, just have a little bit of latency just with writes. And right. you can induce that in a way that's extremely subtle, but also, like, if you can perceive the behavior of the system, you'll be able to catch it.
Kevin is holding an interesting smile with, I think, a comment ready to launch.
Yes.
Let's hear it.
Oh, no. It was more the humor that Justin is gaining out of how to break things. I found it humorous.
You do have a playfulness, curiousness to your approach, which is fantastic, Justin. So I want to bring up the topic of automation because to do some of the things I think we're talking about, let's go set up an environment. Let's create this scenario. Let's do that. It's a lot easier to do it if you have your deployments and test environments scripted or automated. But what do we automate? And this comes up in testing all the time. Do we automate every test? Do we automate everything? How do we decide what to automate if we're starting on that journey? How do you find the blockers, the bottlenecks, or the things that are going to make a big difference versus just start at the beginning and at the end of automating everything?
I mean, in the perfect world, everything's automated. All the unit tests are automated. But we don't live in a perfect world. I've always said at the very least, I need all my non-edge cases automated. So if somebody does the following 5 clicks and does this, that, and that, if someone's trying to break the system, maybe it breaks. But if the basis of how the system works isn't automated, we have a problem. If a customer needs to click this button to place an order, then that's got to be automated. All your deploys have to be automated, because if you're not deploying your deploys, whether it's however you're doing it, spinning up something in Kubernetes, actually doing a deploy, however your company works, if that's not all automated, you're always going to be behind the 8 ball.
And also what you got to think, right, is developers are really good at developing their stories and delivering them. What an SRE then has to do is not maintain those 5 steps, right? Because you can assume that they're going to work. They're going to have to maintain the fact that those 5 steps could be performed by millions of people within the next few minutes, which, could take down the whole website, right? You got, Microsoft, when they released the Xbox Series X, nothing changed functionally on the website. It was the same before the Xbox as it was after the Xbox, but adding the Xbox in, took all the stuff down, all the bots were trying to get them, and it took down the environment. And so that's where, and that happens really frequently, actually, far too frequently for, what should be happening, right? Like, if you know that you're going to be releasing a games console, you should just, know that you're probably going to get bombarded by bots, and to play dumb is not really an excuse anymore, right? Because I legitimately couldn't get my Xbox, small story, right? But I think that's where, you need the automation when it comes to the testing, because the only way you can reproduce that scale is through automation, right? And being able to run those bottlenecks and at least identify where you begin to break in the infrastructure, whether it's in a database query or whether it's in a piece of code that loops and has like memory issues. It could be anywhere. And I think SREs should take the role of like trying to break the code almost at scale, because that's really where they're going to be pointed at. Like as soon as the website goes down, they're going to be the ones reacting to it. So it should be in their best interest to try and see what the thresholds are of the system so that they can react better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Justin. Sorry.
Okay, so what I was going to just
please.
offer is a little bit of a counterpoint. There are some limits. So there are some boundaries that you ultimately do have to use judgment about. So I know in our case, we actually have some integrations that have to run on physical systems. And so for those physical systems, there's just it's a very expensive allocation because you need to actually, have someone put them in a rack somewhere. Right. And so you can't run 100 of those tests concurrently. They're singletons, right? And so just having some boundary where you've convinced yourself that, we're going to run this test often enough, but not in every commit, some or once a quarter. And there's reason to believe that it's stable. And there's reason to believe that we can monitor it at runtime once it's in production. So basically, like everything else, you're going to apply some judgment on the boundaries. But yeah, absolutely, of course, indoors, test as much as you can. But then eventually, part of eliminating toil is not trying to get that 99 that last percentile in your test coverage, and just accepting that you have other mitigations to catch if something goes wrong in that sector of the code.
Is it 80% of the work is trying to get that last 20%? Right?
Of course, yeah.
If you can actually achieve it. We're talking about sort of testing the limits. And again, it's not just the apps, right? It's the full stack, the infrastructure, the environments that we're operating in. What about efficiencies? What role do SREs play in finding ways of doing things more efficiently, whether it's earlier in the development cycle or the architecture or something in operations?
Mm-hmm. I can take that up, Mitch. I think efficiency, one part we just talked about, automation is definitely part of it. As everyone said, you can't automate everything. So you have to look at like processes that are repeating. 80% of the work maybe can be automated. I also think of it as like process as code. Usually automation means that a computer or a robot is running it automatically, right? But it doesn't have to be always like that. There is a person driving it, but the process is codified, meaning that there's code that is doing those things, specific actions, but a person is driving maybe step by step. So I think that's where you gain a lot of efficiency in bringing process as code. A simple example would be that run this test first on dev and then staging and then production. And then based on certain things, you do certain actions. Those actions are automated, what you are supposed to do. The tests are automated, but someone is driving this process overall, like, okay, I first run it in dev, then staging, then production. And if something is wrong, I won't let this code go to production. So that kind of decision, human in the loop, I think that helps. So process as code is what I generally say is a good way to gain a lot of efficiency. There is a lot of things that happen, like collaborating on Slack or getting approvals or compliance. We are waiting for compliance and then time adds up. So you want to automate the action itself, but there is a person driving it using that code.
The only thing I wanted to add that's a little bit of a warning here is I do, the feeling of having great leverage in your task is awesome. The feeling of having something that feels clean and good and easy to understand is awesome. All those feelings are great. There's sometimes the word efficiency can be dangerous because you are evaluating it maybe at a scope that's too local, right? So an efficient use of For example, our cloud spend, right, would be the one
Sure.
that you might get into a little bit of a danger zone optimizing the AWS bill, as opposed to the higher level SLO, for example, which is going to have a lot more costs in it. It's just going to be harder to see because you don't see the invoice. Okay. So if anyone ever wants to just have that feeling of the word efficiency being a little bit of a dirty word, you have to read the book, The Goal, right? It's a business book. It's obviously a lot of people have read it, but just read that book and then come back and ask, am I thinking about efficiency at the right scope?
+1 on the goal, by the way.
Yeah, that's why I don't like a mean time to remediation. That's just a very narrow sense of efficiency.
Sure. Yeah.
I was just getting up to show you there's actually a graphic novel version of the goal now
Oh, great.
that I found. So I had to buy it. So if you're into Goldblatt's work. So yeah. And finding constraint-based management, finding bottlenecks, etc. Lots of good stuff in that. Any other thoughts on efficiencies? Great. Well, let's shift. I'd love to hear your recommendations on technologies, and I know obviously everyone works at a technology company, providing solutions or to some are a great aspect in this. What are some categories? And by the way, thank you for everyone's getting a gold star for not turning this into commercials for your companies, but we really thank your companies for having you here. What are some maybe categories of in your toolbox, in your quiver as an SRE, capabilities you want to have, whether it's open source, a product, commercial product, somewhere in between, something you write, build yourself this. What would you describe? How do we help people with that?
I'd say a lot of it depends on where upper level management wants to go. I mean, my preference is actually not open source, because every open source tool I've ever used, for the most part, sooner or later, people stop developing in it, and now you end up taking that on yourself. Self-developed stuff I've always said only when necessary. Like, I remember I worked at Warner Brothers in their game division, running, we called it the release engineering team. It was basically closer to an SRE team, and we developed Ansible about a year before it came out. 3 developers working for a year, and we released it. And about 2 weeks later, one of my guys walked up to me and went, "Hey, look at this new thing called Ansible. It solves all of our problems, and we just wasted 3 man years developing it." So I've always said, try to stick with tools that exist unless you need to reinvent the wheel. Anyone else?
Yes, I think one set of tools I really like is infrastructure as code has become like a very good principle for SREs to follow, that you want to codify your process or the actions that you're doing on the infrastructure. So Terraform clearly is there. I also like Pulumi, which is allowing people to use regular programming languages like Python, JavaScript, and many other languages, Go as well, to write in infrastructure as code. So that's one thing I want to really emphasize for folks, I think, listening as well, that writing code for infrastructure doesn't have to be in a DSL. Terraform has created this special purpose language that is simpler, more for specifying the configuration and then realizing that in infrastructure. That's great. But that doesn't mean that you can't use Go or Python to do the same thing. Maybe even in some cases simpler way, because procedural languages are different from like using a DSL where you're specifying configuration. I think that's an exciting space. Pulumi is one, and I think Kubernetes communities are working on a few other tools as well. I think the infrastructure as code tools definitely people should check out.
I'm going to throw in one that I kind of alluded to earlier, but I'll just say it's maybe a little bit of a practice that's not super common. So I'll say, as long as you have something that's collecting metrics and you've got your So like, you've got your sort of, let's say, Prometheus style, counters going on. You've got your request tracing going on. You've got a good solution for logs and sort of all of that observability. Sort of, you have a scheme for all of that. What I would additionally add is I would add in something that does blend easily with your analytic domain, so that goes into your data warehouse. And so a good example of that is basically just a generalized event capture system. So Snowplow would be an example, but Mixpanel or anything else like that as well. It's more sort of maybe for like more coarse-grained events, but like major sort of business events in your domain that actually end up kicking off a cascade that you could then look at with your tracing system. Make sure that's joinable by some identifier, and then you'll be able to relate growth and changes in your user behavior that you're looking at in your BI systems all the way in to your SLOs. So that's what I would just say. Like if nothing else, just check out Snowplow and make sure it's flowing into an analytic database that's fast enough to, answer queries quickly, so that you can sort of answer your questions a little bit at SRE speed.
Yeah, no, I would kind of add to that as well. Like, I think data is the most important element these days, and we do a lot to generate data, but we don't do a lot to actually contextualize and capture that data into that specific location, right? So no matter whether it's logging data, topology data, telemetry data, all of that is going to be valuable as long as you can contextualize it, because then that way you're going to be able to quickly and easily not just see where there's an issue, but as we move into Kubernetes and all this other stuff, you have way fewer like hard outages, but you get a lot more nuanced issues that are happening now, which may have gone missing if you're just using Datadog for health, for example. You kind of need to keep track of multiple data sources, but then also figure out a way to put them into a topology or a dependency, because otherwise, you're gonna miss out on a lot of opportunities to avoid war rooms. Let's just put it that way. And focus a lot more on remediating and less time triaging and more time being proactive. And obviously that could be in line with whatever your organization's into, whether they're looking to optimize the end user experience, create a more secure user experience, all of these different things. The SRE is ultimately going to be responsible for at least monitoring, right?
Very good. Well, let's do this. I want to make sure I get in, let folks know who our gift card winners are, and the folks here at Techstrong Live will reach out to you and let you know how to get your gift cards. The 4 winners are Grace G, JSP, Paris, I'm not sure, I'm sorry, DARIUSZ. I'm not sure how to say that. And Caitlin are our winners, so we'll be reaching out to you. Let's do this as our kind of parting thought. Let's speak to the person in our audience and that maybe in the 1 to 2 year range of kind of on this journey, either their organization or them themselves. As folks that have some years of wisdom from doing SRE, what would be the one piece of advice each of you might offer if you were going to mentor somebody who is embarking or on this journey to become an SRE? Anthony, do you mind taking a first crack at that?
Yeah, sure. I think you need to develop empathy. If you just look at things, we already kind of mentioned this earlier, but if you just look at things as like dashboards, metrics, SLOs, you're going to get very bored very quickly. Whereas if you focus on the end user experience, your job becomes a lot more real, and then it also motivates you to go a little bit above and beyond. And it makes you more inquisitive, because maybe you're not responsible for a certain element of the product that is providing a subpar experience. Then it's not on you to fix that necessarily, but it's as part of a a community, you need to kind of be there to kind of highlight those issues, bring them to attention, highlight a potential remediation if you have the technical chops to go to that level. I would definitely recommend just that pure empathy and viewing of things is more important than any process, tool, or whatever, because that's going to really drive you to do your job optimally.
Jump in, whoever would like to be next.
So I'm gonna say if you're really just a couple years in, and you don't already have a home lab, I'll just say you definitely should. Please, I don't know, your roommates or your significant other, just let them know you have to have that many Raspberry Pis, and that's life, and just that's how it is. Because when you experience things physically, it creates a different impression than an API call to Azure. And so have your own stuff. Do silly things with it. How many digits of pi can you get your your local lab Gates cluster to calculate for you? Can you just fork Bitcoin and start over and start mining blocks yourself and make yourself Satoshi in your lab? Can you use the archive.org and have a fake internet that's from 2001? Just recreate it all in your lab. Do silly stuff like that, and I don't know, that to me that's a great part of making it real. Not just waiting for the next task in your main job to advance your learning. So just take responsibility for enjoying it, and reserve some of your stamina each day to invest in yourself.
Great.
I'd say
Yeah,
the Raspberry
exactly.
Go ahead. Yep.
Yeah, I would say the same thing as was Justin was saying. I was going to say, be a builder. That's one thing I really liked when I was in college. Like Justin was saying, we were still putting servers together. Those were the days, right? Figuring out how TCP/IP worked without knowing what exactly it is, right? So, and then setting up Linux. I know very early versions as well. That's what got me into this. I never thought of it as ops or engineering or code versus not coding, all of that. It's about building things, tinkering with things, being a hacker kind of attitude, where not necessarily doing malicious hacking, but that curious nature of trying to learn how this works. I think that's what makes it very exciting for me even today. And I think folks see the same thing, that try building things, tinkering with infrastructure in many different ways, like whether you're doing monitoring, coding, running Terraform, playing with different clouds, whatever it is, always keep building.
Kevin,
Sorry,
bring it
go
home
ahead.
for us.
Yeah, I was going to go down two different quick paths. The first one is when I was actually interviewing people to become SRE infrastructure people. The Raspberry Pis are great, and I thought that was, but the fact is most of the cloud environments offer free accounts. And I always found you were almost sabotaging your own career when you walked in and you showed me all your great scripting you've done at another company and all this great stuff. And then I turn around and say, okay, so stand this up in Google, stand this up in AWS. And they just look at me like, what are you talking about? And it's like, these are free accounts. Take advantage of them and learn them. It doesn't mean you got to create an incredible environment, but you can do most of the small stuff and it's all free. The other thing I always want to say when you're taking on a task is remember how to eat an elephant one bite at a time. And too many people, they get overwhelmed trying to do the entire picture of what Google's doing with SRE. And really remember just to keep things small and break things down so you have wins and successes.
Mm-hmm.
That's all.
Sorry, when my browser decided to play a website. So sorry for the background noise. Well, I want to thank each of you for being here and thank your companies, Everbridge, Filament, and Strong DM, as well as Stack State for having you here. Thank you to all of you for sharing your knowledge, and thank you for our audience for being with us today. Enjoy the rest of your day. Be careful,
Thanks,
be safe.
everybody.
We'll see you out there.
Yeah, thanks,
Thanks.
Mitch. Thanks, guys.
And include running end-to-end